Good morning. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge a few people. First, thanks to Dr. Mon. She facilitated the arrival of Master Sergeant Sohail Sheikh. He's sitting up front trying to hide. Reached down. Sohail is a partner with us. I'm a PhD student here at George Mason University's Center School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and also a research fellow at the Narrative Center. And the two questions that you guys asked, I hope this methodology could give you an opportunity to think of this alternative. But Sohail is here because there's a partnership between his organization, the Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group, and the Narrative Center to think about how do we field capabilities in the narrative sense with the military and share it with our partner. In fact, Sohail is like 48 hours back from his recent deployment, and he is 3 times, I think, deployed to the Counter-ISIL Coalition, supporting narrative capacity building with our partners in the region. So I can't wait till lunch so I can get back and talk to him again and figure out what field reports he's gained, what knowledge he's gained. He brings that back to us here at the Narrative Center. We share that with our students and our faculty here, and we try to come up with some potential alternatives to what we're seeing. And this particular project was sponsored by the Shapiro family, so I thank the Shapiro family for giving us a little bit of seed money to get this project underway. But if I could offer, last spring, Mark Gopin, who's the director of the World Religions and Diplomacy Center here at George Mason, came up to me in frustration with his hands up in the air saying, you know, we brought some minorities at risk from Iraq to the House Foreign Affairs Committee to talk about their individual stories, their individual narratives of what's challenging them. And then later, he had the opportunity to talk to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, was General Dempsey. And he came back and expressed frustration as I'm getting these stories out to the places where I think in the policy community should make a difference, and they're not making a difference. So with his hands raised in the air, he says, John, what do I do? I said, well, I don't know, but I'll think about it, and I'll think hard. At the same time, I'd had conversation with, I won't name him, but he's an Australian Army officer that was working on the Counter-ISIL Coalition, and his frustration was, in that coalition, he was tasked to create a coalition narrative, and he was struggling with the various identities from all the countries that were participating, trying to coalesce into one particular narrative, and he was unable to do that. It just so happened at that time, I had just finished reading Dr. Sarah Cobb, who's the director of the Narrative Center, published an idea in the Narrative and Conflict Journal that says narrative braiding for public officials. And the idea was that public officials are often isolated in their spaces, whether they're military isolated in planning, whether they're congressmen isolated on Capitol Hill, what have you, and they're not hearing the stories that are happening in the community, and that's where the problems should be solving. They should be solving those problems that are in the community. So how do you connect those stories to the people who are making policy? And she offers that in conflict, we've heard, in fact, this gentleman right here is talking about how do you build trust. Well, one of the challenges with conflict narratives, because by their nature to solve complex problems, we try to create binary conditions of us versus them, good versus evil. And in that process, we begin to delegitimize the other person, right? And there you start losing trust because now you become an other. You're not part of my in-group. So we're broken down the bonds of trust. So what Sarah is offering is to use narrative approaches for conflict resolution. You have to add complexity back to those very thin narratives of us versus them, good versus evil, to introduce new characters, new episodes, new plot lines to thicken the narrative, if you will, so that you can explore what are the potential solutions to solve these problems. If you add more characters, more episodes, it creates a greater opportunity to bring other people in to help solve this singular problem. So she's offered this idea about narrative braiding. Now, if you think about the analogy of a rope, the analogy of a rope is made up of fibers, yarns, and strands. Now let's carry that to the individual narrative. The individual narrative comes with its own fibers, yarns, and strands that are religious, their identity groups, their national structures, their attributes that create that individual strand. But as you bring those fibers, yarns together into strands and then wrap it into a rope, now you have a rope that's both, you can stretch it and it comes back to its original form. It can carry huge loads, obviously with the help sometimes of other mechanisms, but it can under strength carry heavy loads and be resolution for us. So this was the idea that how can we highlight, as you see the colors here, how can you highlight those individual distinct narrative strands and bring them all together into one particular narrative to help us be a new logic for action? And it starts with creating a better formed narrative. So hearing Mark's dilemma about the minorities at risk, hearing my Australian friend's dilemma about trying to braid this narrative at the Australian Coalition, and seeing Sarah's article, I started asking around and talking to people, what are the possibilities of this particular idea? And I was put in touch with a young man that was part of a leadership development program here from the Department of State from the Middle East. He was part of the Syrian Revolution, a Syrian Kurd, and when I explained this idea to him, he says, I know this is going to work because this is how the Syria Revolution is kicked off. And I was a little taken aback, but then I saw a little glimmer of hope. And what he said was, I was Kurdish, but when I came to Damascus for university, I was able to retain that identity, but became part of something larger than that. And despite where people were in Syria, we all coalesced towards a better Syrian future together, but I was able to retain who I was. He says the unfortunate thing was the Assad regime was able to violently kind of pull back and pull those strands away and allow it to fracture, but the idea that he was able to coalesce in a nonviolent fashion toward, while retaining his individual identity, was something exciting for me. So I began to circulate some of these ideas with friends of mine here at George Mason and here in the Military Writers Guild and other places. One of the unique challenges is mapping the narrative landscape. As we know, the conflict landscape there in Syria and Iraq is very complex. There's a number of identity groups, so these constellations of narratives are broad and vast and deep. So that is an immense challenge. But also, if you're thinking about it from a military perspective, the coalition narrative also comes with its own distinct identity groups, with a mix of Australian, British, Saudi, Jordanian, a number of identities that just adds to this complex universe of narrative. But the challenge that Sarah put forth in her article was the way to map this narrative landscape starts first with having conversations that matter, and I'm glad that Patrick mentioned it because we use Winslade and Monk, John Winslade's conflict coaching mechanisms. We use Michael White's Mapping the Narrative Landscape. These are core ideas that we use to begin that conversation with these various groups. Because the idea is, once you can begin these conversations that matter, you begin the process of legitimization. Remember that binary conflict narrative delegitimizes people's presence. So when you begin a conversation that matters, you're structuring a conversation such that the person you're having a conversation begins to realize they are being legitimized in that conversation. So taking these ideas, we set this out into two different phases. One phase was to have the conversations that mattered, and I recruited a broad array of teams. Dr. Mon was part of it. Angelica Martinez, you might have saw her out front. Eric Grenlin, also a member of the team. But a number of our other teammates from around the world, really, from Oregon to Rome to Libya to Kurdistan, they all came together and coalesced to be the braiding agents for this particular team. Most of these people are already out back doing their research in their field. But what they did was, because of our shoestring budget, we reached out where we could, and we reached out on Skype, we reached out on WhatsApp, we reached out on telephone. In fact, a family member of mine was working on the Macedonian-Greek border with refugees, and he was posting Facebook pictures of his presence there, and I reached out and says, Hockey, I need to get in touch with you because we need to get in touch with those folks. And through his cell phone there, we racked up his phone, but he works for a big philanthropy organization. He was able to write that off, so no problem there. We were able to have conversations with refugees, and we ended up talking with people from refugees in the Macedonian-Greek border to Yazidi girl who escaped ISIS, talking to a Palestinian refugee in Syria, from Basra to Mosul, Baghdad, Ramadi, a number of places, and we kept snowballing this conversation. And one of the last things we asked after we go through this interview process is, are there other stories you want us to hear? And that connected us to another person and another person and another person. Now, the key for these teammates was the next phase. Because of the distance of all these stories far away, we had to bring those stories here because the original intent was, how can we change the conversation here in the policy communities in D.C.? So these folks became braiding agents because they represented the stories of the people that they were interviewing overseas. And yesterday we had that opportunity to have conversations that mattered. We invited people from the Department of State, from the Department of Defense, USAID, USIP, Alliance for Peace Building, a number of different folks in to have conversations where the braiding team, these braiding agents, can share the stories with those policy communities, circulate those stories, and see where their stories might go. Now, the World Cafe process as a process was just one mechanism. There can be a number of different ways where you can circulate those stories, so I'd offer don't center on World Cafe. It's certainly not a process that I owned, but it is a George Mason student who came up with the idea. But what we saw was, through this conversation in the World Cafe, where we've planted the stories with our braiding agents, with the people from the policy community, what emerged from those conversations is what I call points of concurrence. And it's on those points of concurrence from which we can braid a new narrative. And some of the points of concurrence that we saw were alienation, dark forces about dark ages, conspiracy theories. But we also found that between the interagency, I mean, we've been talking about it for 15 years, but between the interagency, they're not talking, right? So what was happening was we had a person from Department of Homeland Security who admitted that one of her jobs is planning for refugees' arrivals to the United States. But at no time in their planning have they ever considered the stories of the refugees and what do they need and what do they need for them coming into the United States. She said, this is the first exposure I've had to that conversation. So not striking to me, because I've been in military planning meetings where similar things are happening. There is a narrative that's circulating there that's driving the conversation for military planning, but it's certainly not the narratives from the local level. So what we found, and we're still exploring at this point, this is my last slide, and I'll open it up for questions. What we're still exploring is, what are the new logics for action? Like I said, this World Cafe event was just yesterday, so I still have to go back, pull down all the insights that we've learned, the conversations that we had and explored. We're going to put these individual narratives back into a product to share, and then go back and engage with those communities, with those folks that came to us and say, here are the stories that you heard and you shared, and you actually began reflecting. When I saw the dynamic of this Homeland Security person begin reflecting the stories of the refugee, she began to legitimize the refugee, that she now has ownership of working on policy solutions to support them. So I'd like to take these stories back, take their words about what they said should happen, what they said they think they should do about these stories, bring that back to them and says, remember this conversation we had, remember the promises you made, what have you done, how can we help, where can we go? This was a beta test of this idea that Sarah came up with, so we're still working on scaling up as an idea, but it's an opportunity, and I welcome all your questions. Thank you. I had a participant there, so I'm going to call on Jennifer, invited her to come.
Yes, I got to sit in on the World Cafe yesterday, and really stayed with me over the next several hours. One question I emerged with was, in that context, there were almost proxies for the narratives that you had collected. The people who had spoken to folks who were on the ground were, in essence, the ones who were presenting their stories.
Right.
And it was challenging for the proxies, because in this context, they were almost having to introduce who they were proxy for. And the introduction itself framed how we as listeners were listening to that story then. And it also sort of took time that shortened the time they had to present their story. If you were continuing this process in a World Cafe type event, I think it would be interesting you incorporated an artistic element.
Yeah, I wish I could show a picture of that.
Yes, there were artists there looking for graphic ways to represent the tenor of the conversation. And it almost made me wish that there were a representation of these people who were there, where their stories, their answers to the questions that you could ask them would be posted for people to see. And where there would be some time of the event just dedicated to people circulating among those figures and their posted stories and getting to know them in that way. And then the proxy sitting down and contributing to a different kind of input that they were able to do. So that's just a comment on the format. But perhaps just in the direction of saying, I found it so compelling to be exposed to these stories that I wanted more of them. I wanted more of how they parse the conflict. What do they think is wrong? What do they think is going on? What do they think is motivating actors on the ground? I wanted their view.
Sure. No, Jennifer, I think you bring up a valid point. I think it was just the construct of our project that we're trying to access stories that are further away and bring, all the way in Syria and Iraq, Macedonian border, to the policymakers here in the DC. But as a process, I think you're absolutely right, because what we actually would be better to legitimize their voices is if they were there in the room sharing their voice and hearing, Jennifer, you reflect back their story, and they become legitimized by your reflection of their story. So if you were to take this methodology to the field, you're exactly right. You should be putting the people that have the stories, that are there, and they should circulate the stories. So if you were, for example, I can imagine if you're a USAID team and you're doing conflict assessments, right? There's the CAF 2.0 as a conflict assessment framework. If you took this methodology and you brought this to the field and you had interviews that one-on-one conversation that the braiding agents had with the team, and then invited them to something like a World Cafe, where you begin to circulate those stories amongst each other so they can articulate through their own voice, that would be a perfect methodology of what you're trying to describe, Jennifer. So I agree about that. Sir?
I was going to say, just as a comment, if your friend is trying to get more of an insight into the Syrian refugees and their background, Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto are only a flight away.
Yeah.
And we've got 25,000 fresh refugees up there, and I think that would be a great learning experience for people in their State Department. They're not even have to travel overseas, but to see how the Canadian solution, what's worked, what hasn't
Mhm.
worked. It's a great test bed, and it's an hour away.
Thank you.
I think the other comment you talked about, looking at other people's narratives and perspectives, Stanley Kristen made a good comment. He was actually a Freed Zachariah interview, and he said, when I'm sitting across the table for an Afghan elder or a Pakistani colonel, it's not that I have to sympathize with them, or even on my own troops, I have to empathize with them, at least look at what's going on from their perspective and why they're saying what they're saying based on their recent experience or past experience.
No, I agree. Empathy is key. Sir?
Yeah, I'm a retired foreign service officer, public diplomacy specialist, and I've 3 times headed up whole of government strategic communication shops, all before this administration, so that's a little context. I want to push back a little bit on the idea that the foreign service doesn't engage in a psychological, anthropological approach to analysis before creating programs. I think there are some barriers, and one of them, I think, is the kind of diplomatic analog to the we're in intrastate, not interstate conflicts. One of the problems we have is we're still in this Cold War mode of having American values that we're exporting. And frankly, if you did a cost-benefit analysis of our programs, public diplomacy programs, at least at state, you'd find a lot of money is going into those values rather than into the critical CVE fight where we're listening and taking these recommended paths in terms of analyzing narratives. The second thing, frankly, that's missing in this administration is whole of government deep dives on exactly these questions that bring together think tanks like the ones represented here, academics, and U.S. government analytical communities, from state to the intelligence community to USAID that does do some research like this. A third barrier are fortress-like embassies, security paranoia, that even if you have a competent officer, keeps her or him from getting out, the way my generation could. And then, frankly speaking, language competency has not been mentioned once in this discussion. And a couple of our speakers that, were talking from a point of view of field experience, so mispronounced some key names and words that I have to scratch my head and ask, were they really out there, or were they just working all those months through translators? You need language competency. So those are my comments from a slightly different perspective.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. And I invite you to engage with, I think your first question was probably more towards Dr. Christian afterwards, but I'll happy to have a conversation. Half of my team spoke Arabic or Kurdish or forms of that dialect, so that was key for me. Any other questions or comments about narrative braiding? Otherwise, I'll give back the team some time. Emma? Thanks.
Good job.